So our predicament, the one that we are all in here at this moment, is that this is a class on writing, but it's quite difficult to teach writing in a large group. I would say generally it's a matter of like 5 or 6 people, and then it's also a question of everyone sharing and of a mutual kind of analysis that occurs. So given that that's the case, I was trying to figure out what exactly I would do here with so many of you. And I thought perhaps I would talk a little bit about my own path to writing and then speak about the pedagogy that I've developed at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a pedagogy specific to writing. And I'll take you through many of the different classes that I've taught there. And then we'll end with some exercises that I'll give you to try for yourselves. And there'll be a few things that I read aloud from by some different authors. So, my path to writing. I was born in Long Island, just outside of New York, in America. And I grew up in a very, very wealthy and I would say ignorant, largely uncultured and ignorant community. And I think that sort of placed me at the edge. My brother had Down syndrome, and so when I went to school, they also thought that I had some kind of very serious learning disability. And so I was also in sort of special classes for many years. And I think that put me, as a writer, one of the crucial things is to always be between things, to be able to give your heart to specific endeavors and with your empathy to dive into one body and then another body and another body and try to feel what others are feeling. However, we also want to stand apart, because one of the true ways of vision is to see things from outside as well as from inside. And so I think I was given from the beginning to being on the edge and kind of in between, not exactly part of a group. I wanted to be a poet first, and I think it's very helpful. I don't know how it is here in Spanish, but in English, many of the prose writers of my time have just abandoned poetry entirely. They don't really read it, they aren't familiar with it. But poetry is one of the great powers of mankind, and I believe a writer ignores it at their peril. So the first admonition would be to read lots of poetry and to read it deeply, and the poetry of all cultures and all times. I think one of the things that's special about being alive now is the access that we have to so many epics of history and human effort, thought and feeling. And rather than watching some television or participating in some, sporting event, we can be immersed in the mind of someone who lived in the 5th century. It's really quite wonderful. And I think the greatest trap that a writer can fall in is to be of their epoch only. So that is like just these years, to have your speech and its true meaning somehow stuck within this feeble little piece of time that we'll live and die in. I think that's too small. So we should reach with our arms and legs in every direction. Anyway, I began with poetry, and I went to school for poetry, and I wrote many poetry books and gave them to my friends. This is an interesting thing probably for you all as well. Our friends are not often the ones who will know or appreciate our gifts, I think. In fact, one has to wait until, because even when work is published and goes out into the world and is read, often it's championed for the wrong reasons and with some kind of deep misunderstanding. This is good for humility, I think, but also it just means that one has to be patient, and then the true readers come later, and often far afield, far-flung strange people who can see directly into your heart. Let's see. I published a book of poems, and I found that it was not enough for me to live on. The little amount of money that they pushed into my pocket and then I went away down the street with. And so I decided to start writing novels because I felt it would be rather easy compared to writing poetry. And this did turn out to be true, for the reason that novels are very recent and poetry is like a long-standing thing. So to write a true poem that will stand against, I don't know, I mean, it would have to be similarly good as the Bhagavad Gita, or, you know, to be a true poem. That's difficult. But to write a novel, it only has to be equivalent to Daniel Defoe or, you know, Lady Murasaki. It's an easier task. And so I began to publish novels, and I was living in France and then in Iceland, and I had the offer from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to come there and teach writing. And I had always hated almost all the classes I had taken in my whole life. I hated the classes in elementary school, in high school, in college, in graduate school. And I thought that the true thing was just a direct relation with a book on my own terms and by myself. And I liked nothing better than to discover a book that it seemed no one else had read. That was sort of the greatest pleasure, to have that special secret, carry it under your coat. And so when I was asked to come and teach writing, I was in a very difficult spot because I wasn't sure what the best way to go about it was and how to do it. Not that I lacked for ideas about how to do it, but it's not really clear, because the number one way for people to get better at writing is simply to read deeply and to write a lot. And the writing a lot is even less important than the reading. I think the reading is the maximal thing. And then there's also the case of the mind and the progress of your thought and the shapes of your thought. And I think that's affected less by technical writing practice than it is by experience and reading and the act of being a witness in the world. But all of those things don't really occur in the classroom. That's not a progress that can take place in the classroom. And so I was a bit, bemused and not sure how to proceed. And so I thought about it. And I decided that I would teach classes that were classes about habits of life, basic units of seeing and thinking and feeling, and that therefore, if the students could join me in undertaking these somewhat ridiculous and pleasant exercises in their life, they might themselves see more in their day-to-day life, and by seeing more in the day-to-day life and making different choices, become, dare I say, more interesting people. And then if you take a bunch of writers and you say, these ones are a bit less interesting than these other ones as people, the ones who are more interesting tend to be, on the whole, better writers. So by trying to make them more interesting, I would therefore help them in their writing. And so the first classes I concocted were a class on, one was a class on lying, another was a class on lucid dreaming, and I'll talk more about these in a minute, another on pamphleteering, many different classes. But there's a central trouble with the teaching of writing. In the US, the general method, I'm not sure what it is here, is something we call the workshop. So you sit down at a table with a bunch of other writers, generally, you could say your peers, and then some master, teacher. And you've given your short story and everyone looks at it. And then you sit there and you're not allowed to speak. And everyone critiques the things that are wrong with your story. And at the end, you take these bloody sheets of paper and sort of with your tail hanging very low, and you go back into your little den and cry and cry. I didn't like this model very much, although I will say it can work very well if the teacher is a very powerful, sensitive and gentle person, and if they're sort of operating on all, like an engine on all cylinders, really doing their job very well, and if the students as well are thoughtful and well-intentioned, if they're mature in a sense. But I didn't feel at the time that an object is functioning, like is really functional, if it requires like true excellence for it to function at all. You know, what would we say about a spoon? That if you use the spoon with the most grace and art and athleticism, you could get a bit of soup into your mouth. We wouldn't think that that was a spoon. We would have a different name for it, and we would find a spoon to eat the soup with, or eat it with our hands, or lift the bowl to our mouths. And so in the spirit of kind of lifting the bowl to the mouth to eat the soup, a friend of mine and I thought of a different way of teaching writing. And this is modeled on a Quaker model. I don't know if you're familiar with the Quakers. It's a religious movement, a society of friends, sort of anti-hierarchical movement. And they had a way of solving problems in the community. I don't know when they ceased to use it or if they still use it. Not even sure if they live in proper communities. I know there's many meeting houses in the different cities of the world. But when they were living in stricter communities, some of the elders would go to a place and the person with the problem would come and sit down with them. And then these older, more experienced members of the community would hear that person speak about their problem for a little bit, and then they would just ask questions to the person about the problem that they had until the person themselves was led to the solution to the problem. And at that point, the meeting was over and they could go. So we felt, my friend and I, that this might be a really good way to teach writing. And so we developed it into something called the asking method. And in the ensuing 20 years, that's the method I've always used for the evaluation and criticism of work in the class. So I'll say a little bit about that. The thing that is in least supply in writing is the propensity to begin and to work. Everything else can come later, if at all. But to begin is really enough and is necessary. And there are so many hours in the day and week and month and so many years in the life that if you want to create a real work, you go around in the world, witness things, feel them, the reverberations, and then you work and you make things. And one of the flaws of the workshop model that I was discussing before is that even in the case that someone's short story is improved by it, let's say, or a poem is improved, it could take away from the general feeling of momentum and energy that the particular writer has. And then they go home and they don't write for some weeks or months, or they fall into the doldrums. And so I wanted a method that would give the utmost momentum and energy to the writer. And one of the things about our work as writers is that you only see part of the work. You make the work and you see this sort of spur. It's a spur to others' imagination, a spur to others' thought, a spur to others' feelings. And you don't see this full world that exists in other people's minds. And so I thought that in the questions that people ask you about your work, let's imagine that you yourself have provided, we're sitting in a group, maybe 10 to 15 people, and there'll be at the front of the room a kind of a stage that I set up. And on the stage there are 2 chairs, and you're sitting in one chair, and then beside you is sitting your advocate. We'll speak about your advocate in a minute. But when people ask you questions about the story that you wrote and that you gave to them and that they read, in the questions is implicit some understanding, some ripple of thought that shows to you in a very gentle way the world that they beheld in your work. And that helps to strengthen your resolve and your energy. I think writers often suspect, especially at the beginning, that their work is just sawdust and that it can't really cause much in others. And so this is an immediate rebuttal to that. There are some rules to the way that questions can be asked. Questions should not involve very much judgment. That is to say, a question should be a true question where the person doesn't know the answer. And the question should not involve too much praise. That's one that is the hardest. People will often, as a preamble to a question, just, give the writer a pat on the back in some way. It's just a societal thing. We ease the moment with a joke or a flattery. And so, but the problem is that if someone praises your work in a particular way, this is the most pernicious and awful thing that could possibly ever happen to you, because you begin to believe that that aspect of the work is the thing that you are best at or that you can do really well. And then, almost by accident, the next time you're writing along and happy, and you get into a pinch, and then you're like, oh, I should do, that maneuver went over really well the last time. And then with a knee-jerk reaction, you just spew out this thing which is kind of similar to the previous thing. It could be like a little deft bit of dialogue or a luxurious description. It could be anything. But you begin to lean on that as a kind of crutch. And the reason why this is especially awful is because in early works also of writers, the things that come off the best are generally the things that are the least felt and the least true. In a particular story, that part which is ugliest, most misbegotten, it's not like you don't know that piece of the story is totally fucked up. You do know it as you're writing it, and you want it to be better, but you retain it there anyway, despite it being sort of like hard to look at, because for you it is the core of the story. And that's the part that's least likely to be praised. And so if you imagine a model wherein all the things that matter the least to the writer are praised the most, and their heart's deep ambition is ignored or criticized, it's simply no good. So one would wonder if in the process of the class someone asks a question so magnificent and thoughtful and deep that the writer feels nothing but the urge immediately right then to begin writing. Well, in this model, the writer's allowed to just get up and leave the stage and go and begin to work. Because that's the whole point. The whole point is just the production of more work. It isn't some, overall metric of evaluation that has to occur within the confines of a classroom and the parameters of the students and their vision. No, it's just that you can make more work. The advocate sits beside you and controls the pace of the questions and the timing, and cancels questions that are outside of the parameters of the class. So questions that involve too much judgment, or even it might be that you have a short story, I don't know, you've written 3 previous stories for the same class, and they all are about speedboats. You really like boating, I don't know. And you don't want the questions in this particular asking to be about speedboats. So you would say, no questions about speedboats. And so this person next to you, they call on the different members of the class, they ask for a restating of questions, and they observe also the silence that surrounds your mulling over the answers. So the questions don't come like bang, 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 like the shots of a gun. In fact, you're given a lot of time to answer. And the reason is that what you say verbally in the room is almost immaterial. It's just meant to continue and make it possible for people to ask more questions. But the true thing is what's happening in your mind and in your thoughts, occasioned by the questions, which is the enlargement of the work and a deeper understanding of your own potential as a writer. So that's the asking, and that's sort of how that has gone. There's a man named Rai Beni Narayan. He wrote in the Kissa genre, which is a bit like folk tale in Urdu in late 18th century. I'm going to read a little bit of a story that he wrote. It has bearing on the teaching of writing, which is why, and I like it as well. So. The chroniclers of past times and the storytellers of yore have strung together the lustrous pearls of these rare tales and wondrous yarns in the skein of narrative thus, that in a land among the auspiciously founded, vastly populated lands of Hindustan, the image of heaven, there lived a king who was majestic as Jamshad, glorious and of noble lineage. So he goes for a while and he speaks about this king named Kevin Shah. One day the king was looking out at the river from his fort window. Crowds of people were going about their business. Crowded boats were ferrying passengers across the riverbanks. The king was regarding their arrival and departure with interest, when a crowded boat moored near his fort and its passengers got off and set out for their destinations. A fakir, which is a kind of a holy man, had arrived in that boat, and after everyone had disembarked, he too stepped off and headed for the king's fort, arriving under the window where the king was watching the riverside. The guards and mace-bearers of Kavan Shah, Shadow of God, said to him, "O fakir, why do you stand here? This house is above the stature of the likes of you. Even angels dare not alight here, let alone a beggar like you. Tell us your purpose in coming here." The fakir answered, "Good fellows, I have not come to beg. Go and tell your king that a fakir at his radiant majesty's palace door is desirous of an audience and speaking to him." The royal attendants went before the king and communicated what the fakir had said. The king said to them, "Show him in." As per the king's instructions, the fakir was brought before Kavan Shah and said to him, "O refuge of the world, you possess all things that the praiseworthy," he gives a long speech like that, "but I wish to sell you 3 injunctions. You may buy them if the proposal finds favor with you, and thank this fakir when they serve you." The king said, "Speak, what are these 3 injunctions?" The fakir answered, "I will not share them with you just yet. I will do so once you have sent for 3 lakh gold pieces. Lakh is apparently some kind of a measure. It's a 100,000, quite a few gold pieces, and agreed to pay out 1 lakh gold pieces upon hearing each injunction. The king marveled upon hearing this demand, and told himself that surely it went against good sense to spend 3 lakh gold pieces for some injunctions. But the desire to hear them did not leave the king's heart, it merely grew. Kavan Shah considered the fact that while he could always acquire more riches, he would not get another chance to hear the rare wisdom the fakir might have to impart. Becoming possessed with the thought, he ordered, "Send for purses of 3 lakh gold pieces and put them before the throne." The royal servants brought the gold as instructed and put it before the throne. Kavan Shah said to the fakir, "Respected sir, 3 lakh gold pieces have been arranged as per your wishes. Now do share the injunctions." The fakir answered, "O refuge of the world, the first injunction is this: it is preferable to wake up rather than continue sleeping." The king was stupefied to hear this and said to himself, "It is known to the whole world that waking up is preferable to sleeping. This fakir has robbed me of 1 lakh gold pieces." When the fakir saw Kavan Shah looking apprehensive, he said, "O refuge of the world, it seems that the injunction I shared did not find favor with you. You must therefore restrict yourself to this injunction and not listen to the other 2 which remain." The king said to himself, "I have already heard 1 injunction. Perhaps the other 2 will be valuable." Thus deciding, he said to the fakir, "Respected sir, I have bought the injunction you shared with me, regardless of whether or not I found it to my liking. Pray take 1 lakh gold pieces from the pile." At the king's word, the fakir counted the gold pieces and put them aside. I rather doubt that he counted the gold pieces, if indeed there's 100,000 of them, but that's what the story says. The king now said, "Pray share another of the remaining injunctions." The fakir answered, "O refuge of the world, the second injunction is this: it is preferable to rise rather than to lie awake in bed." Thus speaking, he took away another 1 lakh gold pieces from the pile before the king. Kevan Shah was confounded by the injunction shared by the fakir and said to himself, "Why did I waste 2 lakh gold pieces over worthless commonplaces?" However, he did not let on. After brooding much over it, he decided he had already lost 2 lakh gold pieces and may as well hear the third injunction, which might be more useful than the other 2. He said to the fakir, "Respected sir, now tell us the third injunction." The fakir answered, "O king, conqueror of the world, the third injunction is this: it is preferable to walk around rather than sit in bed." The king was dismayed upon hearing this and sent off the fakir after paying off the remaining 1 lakh gold pieces due to him, and got up and left the fort for a while. However, the king kept thinking about the 3 injunctions and their import all day long. In the evening, after he had had dinner and retired to his bed to rest, he again recalled what the fakir had told him. He opened his pen box and wrote out the 3 injunctions on a leaf of paper, and ordered it be put up on the wall facing his bed, so he may see the inscription when he woke up. Then the king lay down to rest. The first half of the night having passed, the king woke up, and his eyes fell on the first injunction, and he said to himself that he should do as the fakir had instructed. Having made this resolve, he rubbed his eyes and woke up from his slumber. Then he read the second injunction and sat up in his bed. When he recalled the third injunction, he arose from his bed and stepped out to walk in the palace courtyard. As Kevan Shah walked there, he saw someone gain the palace wall from without with the help of a snare rope. Greatly alarmed at the sight, he said to himself, "All thanks to the fakir. Had I not woken up, this man would surely have murdered me in my bed." And there's a poem testimonial, as often occurs in these old texts. "These words by Abu Ali have been written in gold. The sleeping traveler places himself in danger. Had the intruder been after gold and riches, he could have stolen them." And he goes on, and this is the beginning of the story. And so what happens is that by following these simple instructions, the king manages to move himself out of the path of ordinary life and into a different realm where he perceives and sees things that are different from what he would ever have known. And so perhaps the price that he paid was not too much. This approach, the approach that the fakir takes of giving clear and simple instructions that, when followed truly and with an adamant and powerful heart, will lead to a break in consciousness and in persona and identity, and new flows of information and thought, has been at the heart of the way that my classes are taught. So I'll give you a list of some of the classes. You can also later, when you have room for questions, you can ask me about any of these things. So the first class I taught was on lying. The second one was probably on pamphleteering. A pamphlet is like a small printed text, printed with printing press. And pamphleteering was something that was especially great in that, Voltaire was a great pamphleteer. Often they're political in nature, but for me, I felt that pamphleteering is crucial to the work of a beginning writer, because in fact, at the start, what you are is really a pamphleteer. You don't have the agency of giant presses to pour out, 50,000 copies of your books. However, you can, even with a printer, your own design skills, make pamphlets. And it's very important that you take on the responsibility and grace of deciding that the things that you write are permanent and real, because you choose that. not because a publisher chooses to grace you with their efforts to put you out into the world. Because what changes when you are yourself constructing a final product, in this case that you'll turn into a pamphlet and hand out to some people, is the work is finalized. It's not conditional. You don't want to be in the habit of producing conditional work that later will reach its final appearance or its final. You really want to drive straight to the heart of the matter and leave it there, even when it looks in some ways unnatural, because its unnatural appearance is often simply the fact that it's not in step with the moment or the time or expectations. But that's also the sign of work that is good. So that was a class that had to do with pamphleteering. Another was called The Child as Object, Subject, Protagonist. And we went through many books about children, even some books by children, books in which horrible things happen to children. And there was a lot of imitation in that class. The students would have to write in the style of particular authors, and then after having written a piece in the style of the author, they would have to write a defense of why indeed the work that they had done was truly in that style. And that part was much harder, actually. Portraiture is a class that I've taught often, and it's a great pleasure. The students will have to do a tremendous number, 100 portraits in text. And they go around the city, draw like it can be something as simple as a table, to truly describe a table or a salt shaker, to describe not a person, but an aspect of motion that a person is involved in. Someone who's handing out flyers for a nude club or something, but they have some special way that their arm is moving as they're handing. And if you can just properly make a beautiful portrait of this motion, this is the beginning of real writing, I think. I taught a class on the cinema of dreams, where the students would assemble their dreams into caravans of dreams, and then film them. A class on the paragraph, which I will get to in a minute. A class it's called Transformation of or by the Tongue. This was a class about poetry. I think one thing that is misunderstood about poetry is that it should be understood in some specific way. Each poem has some specific way of understanding it. And while it's true that we should honor poems by trying to know the historical context of the time that they were written in, and the circumstances that surrounded the composition of the poem, the vocabulary of the poem, such as it would stand not within the lexicon of the present, but within the lexicon of the person who had written it. There are many efforts that can go into understanding poetry, and I think that those are good and forthright and worthwhile. But those are all attendant to the main course of poetry, which is simply to listen to it deeply and to allow it to enter your body. And there the poem can do its work or not, I feel. And so one of the reasons why I love poetry is because my relationship to poetry was always that, to take a poem, to memorize poems sometimes, to read them aloud, constantly to read them aloud. And so this is a class where the whole class is just the recitation of poetry. We're all reading poetry aloud. And then when you're not the one reading, you can just sit there and do as you like. Like you can sit silently, you could write in a notebook, you could gaze at your feet, you can do whatever you want. You don't have to, per se, listen to the poem. It's the poem's responsibility to worm its way into you. And in the course of the semester, we probably read 45 or 50 books of poems together. It's quite magical. I like if that one takes place at night. a class on derive. Do you know derive, the situationist technique for walking in cities, and psychogeography? This is a great pleasure in Chicago. Chicago is an extremely bounded and stratified city where from one neighborhood to the next things change quite drastically. Some parts are supposedly very dangerous, other parts are absolutely pacified. So wandering through the city is a way of enlarging one's own understanding of where you stand vis-a-vis society at large, and also of just encountering things you've never seen before. Kafka games was another class. I love Kafka, of course. Perhaps you do too. This was a class in which we read everything that has been translated into English. So like endless volumes of his letters, all of the works, everything. And we would do so in public places. So we would all go to a bus station and all sit in the bus station with our Kafka and read it, or go to an arboretum or conservatory. There were also strange hazards. I gave them an examination on my personal favorite Kafka story, which is Josephina the Mouse Singer. And it was an examination that was so hard that everyone would fail. Impossible questions. And I had a friend compose a really painful musical soundtrack that was sort of blasting in their ears the whole time that they were trying to do the test. And they had broken pencils, and they had to write their answers on the back of a really ugly sheet of paper. It was so many sort of events like that took place in the class. I rented a theater in Chicago in the middle of the night from 3 to 5 a.m. And they would come, and they could bring blankets and things, and I would read The Castle out loud to them. It's pretty nice. Another class was called Unlearning. And I had this idea of a class for unlearning because I do feel that a lot of the process of writing is unlearning bad habits. And I feel that's also the process of coming to maturity as an adult, if we ever truly do come to maturity as adults. And I thought a class on unlearning would be an interesting class. Unfortunately, the people who choose to take an unlearning class are people who feel that they have no learning to do whatsoever. So that's why I said I would talk later about the paragraph as a class, because I had the unlearning class, and then the next semester I chose to teach a class called the paragraph, because I felt that I would get people who really loved no one is going to take that class unless they really love writing. So the paragraph was sort of the obverse of the coin of unlearning. And I like to use all different techniques of teaching, not just contemporary or experimental ones. Some of the old techniques I think are very good. I think memorization, although it is or can be distasteful and frustrating, is really wondrous. I also think copying is very useful. So in this class, the class begins, and for the first 40 minutes, I put a text on the board, and everyone has a journal, and by hand they have to write the text into their journal. And so over the course of the semester, they develop a bestiary of different texts that they have copied by hand. When you write something out by hand, less so when you type it out, but even then, I think retyping things is very good. You come to a completely different relationship with the text. I would certainly advocate taking some of your favorite texts and rewriting them out by hand. You'll find that some sentences that seem short suddenly have a magical length. Some sentences that seem long feel even a bit abrupt. It really changes the nature of tempo, time, timbre. A class that I've taught many times, and I'm teaching right now in Chicago, is called the Brothers Grimm Variations, or the Grimm Variations. I'm sure you're familiar with the Brothers Grimm and the fairy tales that they collected. In this, the one book that you have to read is the Brothers Grimm, and you're supposed to read it several times. And the whole class is a kind of a contest where the two groups of students in the class show up, and they're divided into two groups, I should say. And one group is always going each week. It's their week to perform. And each one will have written a variation on the same tale by the Brothers Grimm. So the class begins and I read aloud that tale, and then each of them in turn reads their variation. And so the variation could be as simple as, I don't know, to write Snow White from the point of view of the witch, or the huntsman, or whatever, to take a common one. It can be more interesting. You could write Hansel and Gretel from the point of view of the oven that they're stuffed into, But you can also change you could move the story into the present. You could take one aspect of the story. There's all manner of ways that they can be varied. But one of the things that makes that class, I would say, quite successful is because the students are pitted, not just, it isn't just that they want to show me their work and please me and have me like it, but they're directly pitted against one another. And so they're incentivized, it's okay, they're incentivized to outperform the other students and show up with something, and not in a way like where the writing is, it's not just that the writing be more excellent than the others, but that even the idea be truly like surprising and great. And I allow all manner of, it's an art school, so sometimes I have students who are fashion designers or filmmakers, performance artists, even video game makers, all kinds of things. And so sometimes other people, they'll do a variation in, there's a video game apparently called The Sims, where you have a whole world that is simulated. And I had someone spend, I don't know, a month creating a Sims world that replicated one of the fairy tales, and they showed it to us on the screen, which was quite lovely. Two other classes that I taught. I tried to always come up with, for some years I tried to always come up with new classes, because I felt like as a teacher, it's important to be present in the class, and if you have used material too often, sometimes you can, even when you're ethically trying to do your best and be present, you can be a little asleep at the wheel. I once interviewed a great memory expert of the 1950s and 60s. There was a comedy circuit which was called the Borscht Belt in upstate New York, where, like borscht, like the soup, because it was a Jewish comedy. I guess Jewish communities and Jewish comedians. And he would go around on this and come to audiences of 1,000 people, and he would remember every single person's name in the audience. He would greet them all as they came in, and then he would just point to people in the audience, and or people would stand up, and he would know all of their names and professions, and it was really truly a fantastic person, very interesting. However, he was very old when I interviewed him for the Believer magazine, and there was no question I could ask him that he didn't have a very long shtick that would immediately begin and would go for roughly 20 to 25 minutes. And so there was I couldn't get new material out of him whatsoever, despite the fact that I could perceive that if he would, I'm sure he had new and interesting thoughts, but he was not ready to confide them. And so this is not how we should be as a teacher, because the principal thing that creates, I would say, true pedagogy is the students feeling that they themselves specifically are being perceived and taught to, received in the teacher's mind and entertained in all their fullness. And in fact, that operation really only needs to take place once in each class. I mean, if you think back to all the teachers you've had, probably there were only a few that you really felt, maybe only one that you felt really saw you and understood you. But I think that is the obligation of the teacher. I was going to read to you a wonderful, this is in my lying class, there was one text in particular that somehow would help to change the way that the students felt and thought about writing. Now lying, I didn't really say why I wanted to teach a class about writing. About lying. Lying is, it's a bit of an ethical swamp where people feel that it is, it's a negative to lie, despite the fact that in our human speech, lying is just one functional tool for, even if we want to say we want to behave as moral, gentle people, lying is still a tool that can help you to do that. And I'm sure you lie all the time, for instance, to tell someone that they look great when they, obviously are about to die or whatever. There's a lot of lies, and there's a lot of, especially in our present culture, which is just rife with lies. The internet, once a place of curiosity and friendship, is now a sea of lies, as you know. And so navigating that and thinking about that was one part of it. But for the writing of fiction, lying is especially interesting and trenchant. So here, there's a writer, his name is Daniel Harms, Kharms, perhaps you're familiar with him. He had a movement called Obiaru in early Soviet Union, and he died in an unfortunate manner, pretty young. He wrote some beautiful children's books as well. This one is called The Copper Look. "You see," he said, "I saw you boating with them the day before yesterday. One of them sat at the rudder, 2 of them were rowing, and the 4th one was sitting alongside you and was talking. I stood on the bank and for a long time watched the 2 of them rowing. Yes, I can be so bold as to assert they wanted to drown you. People row like that only before committing murder." The lady with the yellow gloves looked at Klopov. "What does that mean?" she said. "How can one row in some special way just before committing murder? And then, what point would there be in their murdering me?" Klopov turned abruptly towards the lady and said, "Do you know what a copper look is?" "No," said the lady, involuntarily moving away from Klopov a little. "Aha," said Klopov. "When a delicate porcelain cup is falling from a cupboard and flying downwards, at that moment when it is still flying through the air, you already know that it will touch the floor and break into pieces. And I know that when a person has looked at another person with a copper look, sooner or later, inescapably, he will kill him." "They looked at me with the copper look?" the lady said. "Yes, madam," said Klopov, and put his hat on. Both remained silent for a little while. Klopov sat with his head bent low. "Forgive me," he said suddenly, quietly. The lady with the yellow gloves looked at Klopov with surprise and was silent. "All that is untrue," said Klopov. "I invented the business about the copper look just now, right here as we were sitting here on the bench. You see, I broke my watch today, and everything appears in a dark light to me." Klopov took a handkerchief out of his pocket, spread it out, and showed the broken watch to the lady. "I wore it for 16 years. Do you understand what that means, to break a watch that for 16 years had been ticking right here under my heart? Do you have a watch?" One thing I love about this piece is the way Klopov's access to falsehood permits him to give a beautiful course to his heart's feeling that is both pointed and effective and bizarre. And I love his confession. And then I love that Daniel Harms has realized to make a complete and fully powerful and functional piece of fiction, he just needs to describe this incident, and that's sufficient. One thing that is difficult for writers at first in their career is to recognize what their unit of composition is and can be, and to not be forced into units of composition that are happen to be of moment in the daily course of work. So because a short story is often 15 pages and has an arc, you might feel that your short story should be 15 pages and have an arc. Or because characters are described in some particular way, you might feel, oh, well, they should be described in this way. And all of Daniel Harm's work is, it is its own masterclass in many different shapes of that work can take. So the reading of his work, I think, gives a great freedom to students, and I advocate it heartily. I have another poem I was going to read you by Miguel Unamuno, but before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about the reason I chose it. I think that there is a type of writer who writes very preciously. They write and they think each thing that they wrote has to be preserved and protected, and it's their intellectual property. They don't want it to go away. They don't want to give freely of their work. And I think that while in some cases it might be quite a reasonable approach, in general, your gift will be the size that you believe it to be. And it will fill almost any space where you can open, it's some kind of gas that rushes out and fills the space. And so if, for instance, a magazine that is not very prestigious wants some piece of your work, it's better to just make a work and give it away, and make another work and give it away, and make another work and give it away, and feel that eventually all of the work will find its place, rather than to sort of mete it out really carefully, one bit at a time. Because the game of writing is such a psychological play, and to begin to suspect that you're not strong enough to lift the load, it ends up soon that your arms have weakened and you are no longer strong enough. And in fact, you can only be relied upon for this amount of work in this time. You should feel that if you needed to, you could sit down and just write and write and write. And I mean, if, I don't know, let's imagine that you have a son and he's been captured by bandits who are going to chop off his legs. Unless you write an epic poem over the next 2 weeks, you would give it a try, I mean, it might not be a great epic poem yet, but certainly it would be much closer. And so I think really putting your whole heart into enterprises, and then even beyond your whole heart, we must write with the expectation that places and means are accessible to us that we don't know and furthermore don't understand. And the worth of a text is in these fractures and breaks that can occur. And you want, therefore, to write towards some event that can take place in a tale that shatters the paradigm of the tale and pushes something else pushes through. And if you don't believe that you have access to that place, the work will end up being kind of humdrum, and you'll write stories that are precisely how you planned them, which is really not how they should be. They should go somewhere else. Like when you're playing catch with your friend, and the ball goes past your friend's head and breaks a window. That's what you want to have happen. I'm going to read it in the English, but of course you can all read it in the Spanish later. I'm sure it's infinitely better. Throw yourself like seed. Shake off this sadness and recover your spirit. Sluggish, you will never see the wheel of fate that brushes your heel as it turns going by. The man who wants to live is the man in whom life is abundant. Now you are only giving food to that final pain which is slowly winding you in the nets of death. But to live is to work, and the only thing which lasts is the work. Start then. Turn to the work. Throw yourself like seed as you walk and into your own field. Don't turn your face, for that would be to turn it to death, and do not let the past weigh down your motion. Learn what's alive in the furrow, what's dead in yourself, for life does not move in the same way as a group of clouds. From your work, you will be able one day to gather yourself. I think this is the process of improvement as a writer. It's not enough to want to write or to read. You also have to have some kind of a rigor. You have to develop in yourself some kind of a metric, although not necessarily not like a bean counting, but a metric. There has to be some way that you can judge whether you are making progress or not. Now, that's not to say that you can really know your work, and it's not to say that you will know what's best about it, or that you will truly see how it is that you're improving. However, if it's just like wandering, the work can become self-indulgent, and what's worse, it can become too arcane. The main danger that afflicts the millions of writers the world over is believing that their work is comprehensible, when in fact, although it appears that they're writing in Spanish, in fact they have created a little sub-language that is just their own within Spanish, where things refer not quite to what you would expect, their feelings about this or that are not understood, and so a story which could be quite beautiful is totally incomprehensible. So you have to make sure that your texts reach their object, and towards that end, it isn't necessarily a matter of technical ability. That's more a matter of humility and of my teacher used to say, admit the bayonet, allow this blade that is affixed to the end of a musket, allow the blade to poke through and penetrate your stomach. That's what it is to offer a text to the world. You can't write trying to prove to people that you are smart or brilliant, a genius, wonderful. You write because you walk around in the day and you see these helpless, beautiful worlds that are being squashed, and you just want to speak of them. And that's enough, to have witnessed small things and to speak of those things. And towards that end, what you want is clarity, not greatness, not excellence, just clarity. You just speak a few words in clarity. So maybe we can have some questions, and then after that I'll provide the exercises, and then if there's anything that's not understood about the exercises, then I'll answer some more questions.
Hi, Jessie. How are you? I have a question regarding translation, because you were talking about how you see the world in a specific perspective. Have you had the chance to talk to your translators in other languages to see if they comprehend what you are trying to say?
I think in the first place, it's really, one is so fortunate to be translated at all that I think the spirit with which to enter into these conversations is just one of sort of happiness and delight. I do think there are often bad translations. Globally, many publishers they have very little money and can't afford to get sometimes can't get the best translators, or the translator themselves has like 50 different things that they have to do at the same time, and maybe the result of that is that person can only read the work they're translating rather than 12 other novels that you've written. And if they read all of the different novels, they would appreciate better how to translate this particular one. At any rate, there's a lot of barriers to the translation succeeding, even apart from the completely insurmountable barrier of moving a text from one language into another. But I think we can accept that the text that we read simply isn't the original text. It's another one. And I think the progress of our works through the world is sometimes familiar and sometimes strange. So one's work can be translated directly, as in that a novel is translated as that novel. But it could also simply be that someone, I'm Irish, and the Irish love to tell anecdotes and they say they have the gift of gab, so they're always talking. And I had a friend who, his descriptions of books, it was often better than reading the book, just to hear him talk about how wonderful this book was or whatnot, or how terrible it was, maybe even better when he would excoriate a book. And I think that that's also the passage of the book onward, which is not even to speak of if someone is themselves a sculptor and makes a sculpture having read your book. And not to ignore, someone is a shopkeeper and the way that they assemble their shop becomes different having read a text. I think that's the true passage and the true translation. But I would say in some portion of translations the work is worse, and then in a large, given that most of the books that are published are quite bad, I would say most of the translations, since the translators are probably more thoughtful people than the vain and narcissistic authors, the translations are probably better generally. So I would say, at least in English, I would have more confidence in a book that had been translated than in a book that had not,
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
You were reading just now a poem of Unamuno, who was a Spanish poet, writer from the Spanish modernism, and I was surprised about that because you were telling about your experience and about teaching writing, and it was very old experiments and that, and when you brought that poem was like bringing the tradition to all that experience. And my question is, do you think that tradition is also part of what it means to teach?
One of the things that I think is a teacher must do is to be transparent before their students. I had some teachers who, any book you would name, they would claim to have already read. Of course, professor has read all the books or whatever. Even once I named a book that I knew had been lost, like this book. There's a writer. What is his name? A wonderful Polish writer, anyway, who his magnum opus, he was killed by Nazis, and his magnum opus was lost. And my professor claimed to have read it, and I was like, oh no. But so transparency before the students is very important, and I think part of what's gained from that transparency is that the students can see the bird, the magpie. A magpie has it gathers lots of things together to make its nest. All kinds of strange things. It could be the receipt from a purchase and a bit of someone's dress and many things go to make the nest. And so there's a magpie nature to the progress of writing and writers. And what you want for the students to see is not that you are like the deep inheritor of the tradition. When I went to school, the professors would often give some lecture that was like intended to show that they had dominated the tradition, and now they were going to like hammer you with it or something like this. And that's fine. I mean, it's one way. And again, if the person is magisterial and beautiful, then it's well worth listening to. However, I think another model is of transparency, where the audience can, or the students can see the way in which you made your way through the tradition and took a little from here and took a little from there. And I think, I mean, in this case, this man is, Unamuno is a great and powerful presence, but this is a very like a gentle and small poem, that is like a beautiful encouragement, It's almost, it would be good if it's printed on the side of milk boxes or something, that would be a good life, if that were the case. Yeah. So I think the tradition is something to steal from. And after all, each moment that we can look back on, it already had its chance for things to be used in that way. Now it's our turn to reuse them in other ways.
Thank you.
Hi, Jesse. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your teaching method. I thought it was very interesting. I study creative writing in the United States, so I know a little bit of how it is, how effective it could be, and also how much it can push you to not write for a long time. And leading with questions sounds really interesting. I was wondering how you teach your students the method. How do you teach them how to do it? I was thinking about the role of the advocate. It sounded like someone with a lot of responsibility, and I guess I was wondering how to teach them how to do it.
The classes are generally one semester long rather than a year long, and were it the case that they were a year long, it would be better, because it does take a while to change to this, to understand the expectations and responsibilities of this. Most of the pedagogy of how to ask the questions, how to be the advocate, I try to model for the students just with my own behavior. I try not to be determinative and like cut people off or change their behavior in the class. I think, and Napoleon said the best general gives the fewest orders, because once you give someone an order about something, you have to always give them an order about that, like telling your kid to clean their room or whatever. But I would say one thing that I do is I try to have the first few people who present their work be individuals who are a little more stalwart and mentally tough, because it might be more difficult for them, the first few times. But then after a month or two, people really are in sync and they learn how to. I talk also about how answers are not really the thing in life. Coming up with really great answers it's always a little fatuous and silly. But asking questions that's the real talent in life, is just to ask good questions. And in fact, this is the powerful propensity of fiction, to ask questions and then to give multiple competing answers.
Hi Jesse, how are you? I hope you're enjoying the city. I wanted to know, what are some of the worst bad habits that you have seen in your students as you were talking about this class about unlearning bad habits for writers?
The worst habits.
Yes, some bad habits that you think writers should unlearn.
It's hard to say, because I find as a as I've gotten older, that I tend to find things to like about almost everything. So, and I think, especially if you're paradigmatically, if your mind is broad enough, each student's, like even a work that is full of mistakes, still has possibilities for like great progress and wonderfulness. I mean, it's true that it probably will never be made into something that is even really worth reading, but there is always a potential there. And because even, I don't know, like there's movements like Ulipo, or like some of like William Burroughs would do like cut-ups or things, like just the collision, arbitrary collision of random things produces things that are really interesting. And I think if you looked at, I don't know, if we went into some random house and pulled someone's journal out and we read through all the pages of the journal, most of it would be quite bad, but then there would be parts that are just absolutely wonderful. And the quality of being a good writer is being able to tell. It isn't always, there's different faculties. There's the faculty of production where you produce a text, but then there's also the evaluative faculty where you look at what you did and you try to see if it's good. And that's really more important. That second part is more important than the first part. Maybe it's tiring if you have to produce lots and lots and lots of text before you finally get something that's good, but at least you will eventually get something that's good. The alternate is that you just produce lots of stuff and you can never tell what's good, which, you know, is not what anyone wants. I think the number one mistake is the one that I already brought up, which is to write in a way that is arcane and that can't be understood, you know. So to just assume that people understand you and to not really extend yourself. So I have an exercise that I give at the beginning of a number of classes where the students, in order to become acquainted with one another and also with their own possibilities of their text, have to write instructions on how to do a simple operation. So it could be like to open a door or to put on a shoe, and so then the next week everybody comes in and 15 different people tell you very clearly how to put your shirt on or how to make a pot of tea or whatnot. And I think that really highlights how difficult it is to write instructions. I have the students also try to follow the instructions, and then they end up like not getting the shirt on or, you know, not opening the door. So it's much harder than it seems.
Por eso. I was wondering how important you think it is to read some of the classics, the timeless classics, Ulysses, Moby Dick, those ones.
I don't think it's not worth reading anything unless you can enter into it with joy. So I think it's important to always read. Essentially, there's a list of books that you've read while you were asleep, and then there's a list of books that you read like fully, and the list of books you read fully is like a different set, and that's the list that you really want to be increasing. I think that there is generally most of the great classics have much to be said in their favor, and there's a lot to learn from them. I think that there's an edifice of literary criticism that surrounds them that doesn't necessarily do them very many favors. The path that I usually have taken through literature is to find an author and fall in love with them, and then read their letters and read about their biography and find out what they read, and then go to those books and then again read their letters and then find what books they read. And that's a way that you can travel into the past and find books. And if you know, Proust says this thing about, and you can enter by a front door or you can enter by like a strange side door. And I would say what you want with the classics is to enter by your own strange side door, and then you can find your own delights in them. Thank you, Jesse. I'll give these exercises for you. All right. So the first one is one that is drawn from Salvador Dali. So this one is for harvesting an image from your unconscious or from dreams. So you are to sit in a chair, somewhat, it can be a comfortable chair. In fact, it should be a comfortable chair because it should be a chair that you can fall asleep in. So an easy chair of some kind, as we term it in English. And you want to do this exercise when you are very sleepy. That's the whole point. So you have a key, you have a lot of these keys in Argentina, these beautiful old-fashioned keys. So I'm sure you can all find one. And you want to have your arm over the arm of the chair, have your arm extending over the edge, and have the key gripped between your two fingers, almost as lightly as you can. And then on the floor, beneath the key, you put a ceramic plate, some kind, sitting there. And then you lean back and fall asleep. And in the moment of falling asleep, the key will fall out of your hand and hit the plate and wake you up. And then in your lap, you have a journal, and you just write down what you have just been looking at while you were asleep. So this is Dali's advice. You can try that. The falling asleep part is maybe the hardest. I wouldn't recommend sleeping pills or anything. I don't think it helps anyone. A walking exercise, I have two. One that is less an exercise and more kind of preliminary is to take a map and then draw on that map where you go in the city, the routes that you take back and forth. And I think, some of you may be very various in your habits in this city, and I hope that that is the case. But you may find that you're sort of a creature of habit, and you only go back and forth between just a few places. And it's sort of horrifying, as if you're settling already into your coffin or something like this, And so that's a great. It will drive you to go to new places, I would say. Another one is, this one is, my students really enjoy it, but are terrified of doing it, which is to go on a 5-hour walk with nothing. You can't take your phone, you can't take your identification, you can't take any money. You should hide your key somewhere near your door, nothing, and then just walk in the city for 5 hours, wherever you like. And if you need water, you have to ask someone for it. Completely changes your relationship with the city. Some of my students do this exercise, and others lie and pretend that they did. The last one is a lying exercise. So this one is a little bit dark, but the lying class, it's in dark territory. So it involves manipulation. So this one is the insertion of a false memory. So what you want to do is think of a friend, someone that you know very well, and you want to write a kind of dossier about your friend, and particularly about their vanities. It should be someone that you've known for a long time. And so you write down their vanities, their self-conception, their identity, and then you invent a story about something that happened to you and to that person together. One that seems to reinforce or confirm this person's idea of who they are, right? Especially if they can be a bit of a hero in in the story that you're creating. And then you should have a conversation, usually by telephone is better, because you'll probably give it away if you're in person. But if you're poker-faced, you could do it in person. In the midst of like a long conversation, after 20 or 30 minutes, you can mention that you were thinking back to that thing that happened that time, and then you kind of weave in this thing. And it's not enough to just get them to agree that it happened, which you'll find is pretty easy. It's to get them to add details about the event and what happened, And if it might take, if you have particularly honest or memorious friends, they might say, "Oh, I don't remember that. I don't think that," or humble friends, they might, but your more vain friends will certainly take the bait. So that's a fun one. Well, thank you.